Good evening, ladies and gentlemen in the audience. We're going to go ahead and start our town hall meeting on redistricting 2021 redistricting. I'd also like to welcome those at home that are watching on the internet. We welcome you. Thank you. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jeff Simonetti. He will be going over our redistricting process and what that's going to look like for the city of West Covina.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Simonetti. I'm with the National Demographics Corporation. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this evening, and we're going to give you an overview on the 2021 redistricting process. And let's get the presentation started here. Clicking on the slideshow. Let's see. Resume, maybe?
There you go.
Oh, okay. I'm looking at this screen. We have it on both screens. Perfect. All right. Okay, so this evening we're going to talk about the 2021 redistricting process, talk about some key project timelines and deadlines, next steps and hearings, and we'll also be going over this evening the specific data for the updated 2020 census data. So we have the full data set in terms of your demographics and population data from the 2020 census, and we'll walk through what those numbers look like. So I have a couple of introductory slides here. There may be a question related to why are cities going through the redistricting process? And it's not just the city of West Covina. Any district or jurisdiction that has elections has to look and review the 2020 Census Bureau data. And we also need to ensure compliance with the applicable federal and voting laws and California voting laws. We'll get into some of the specifics as to what those are, and we'll talk more about the applicability, and there are rules and regulations associated with the process. So West Covina council members hold 4-year terms, and the districts and the election sequence is staggered. So districts 2, 4, and 5 terms end in November of 2022, and districts 1 and 3 terms end in November of 2024. For the purposes of the redistricting process, if a new map is drawn, and we'll talk about the process there, the map will be applicable to the November 22 elections and beyond. There are specific processes in terms of how the redistricting process will take place. So the first are 2 initial meetings, which are pre-draft maps. And these are held, again, prior to the release of draft maps. And these are specifically, like what we're talking about tonight, and we'll also be having a second hearing on December 7th. There'll be an education process, and we'll be soliciting input from the general public and the council on communities in the districts that you may want to identify. There were 2 different releases of census data. So the first one was the official U.S. Census Bureau data, which was released in August of 2020. That is a different data set than what we use for actually redistricting and the data that I'm going to show you tonight. The data that we'll be showing you this evening is what's called the California statewide database. And there's a difference in terms of the Census Bureau and the California statewide database. And the difference is prisoner population. So for the purposes of physically conducting the census, prisoners are counted in the prisons. But for the purposes of the demographic data and the population data for each city, the state of California takes that data and assigns prisoners back to their last known address. So it's called zeroing out the prisoner population. And so that took approximately a month and a half for them to do. They released that in late September, and that is the data that we'll be using and presenting to you tonight. There'll be also 2 draft map hearings to discuss and revise draft maps and to discuss the election sequence. Important thing to remember here is that redistricting has 2 parts. The first is what are the physical boundaries of the lines. And then second, there's also a discussion, and the council will be able to make a decision on the election sequence, meaning which districts will be up in 2022 and which districts will be up in 2024. This process has to be completed by no later than April 17th of 2022. And the reason for that is that we have to submit that by no later than that date to submit the map to the LA County Registrar of Voters for inclusion into the November of 2022 elections. When we talk about the redistricting process, there are three sets of rules and goals, and we categorize these into three different buckets. The first one you'll see on the left-hand side are the federal laws, and this specifically pertains to the Federal Voting Rights Act. There are two main components of the Federal Voting Rights Act. First, districts need to have generally equal population, and this will be an important point that we talk about here in a moment, and they can have no racial gerrymandering. And when we say generally equal population, there's case law out there that states that the districts can have a no greater than 10% population deviation. And what population deviation means is the percentage difference between the largest district in terms of population and the smallest district in terms of population. In the middle bucket there, the second that says California criteria for cities in the light blue, this is something that's a law that is different and has passed since you went through the original districting process. This set of criteria specifically pertains to AB 849, which is called the Fair Maps Act, and it was passed in 2019. It creates four, and this is important, that these are rank-ordered criteria for the redistricting and redistricting process. First, the districts have to be geographically contiguous, meaning there are no islands and no disconnected parts of districts. When practicable, they have to have undivided neighborhoods and communities of interest, and we'll talk more specifically about what that is. But generally, they are socioeconomic and geographic areas that should be kept together. The districts need to have easily identifiable boundaries, and they also need to be compact. And when we say compact, it means that they do not bypass one group of people to get to a more distant group of people. And as a universal prohibition, districts shall not favor or discriminate against the political party. On the right-hand side, there are also other traditional redistricting principles in the dark blue bucket there. So there are a couple of key points here. First, we could potentially look at future population growth. So let's say, for example, there's an area in the city that you know there's going to be a master plan community or maybe a large apartment complex that you know there's going to be significant population moving into there. We can slightly underfill that district. It has to be within the population deviation, has to be within that 10% population deviation. But you could slightly underfill that district knowing that there's going to be population growth moving forward, and so that that district can essentially grow into itself. Finally, when we talk about respecting voters' choices in terms of continuity in office and minimizing voters shifted to different election years, this specifically pertains to the election sequence. As I mentioned, there's a two-part process. It's first drawing the actual physical boundaries of the districts, and second, determining which of the districts will be voting in 2022 and which of the districts will be voting in 2024. Let's say, for example, you are currently in a 2022 district, but the lines get redrawn and you get moved into a 2024 district. We try to minimize the number of people that would get shifted between the different election cycles. For the next couple of slides here, we're going to be talking about your demographic summary of the existing districts. And so this is using the official 2020 demographic data within the boundaries of your current districts. There'll be two important components here when we talk about the redistricting process. First of all, we break down numbers between total population and citizen voting age population. So total population means exactly what it sounds like. So that's the entire number of citizens regardless of age within the city. As you can see here, it's your total population right now is 109,856. You go down to the bottom here when you see citizen voting age population, that means any citizen within the city that is over 18 years of age. That is regardless of whether they're registered to vote or not. It's any citizen over 18 years of age. And for purposes of looking at protected class voting, that's the analysis that we look at and looking at the citizen voting age population. Going back up to the top there, you'll see here where we say the deviation from the ideal and then the percent deviation. Essentially, it's a mathematical equation to determine what that deviation from the ideal is. It's just taking the total population of 109,856 and dividing that by the number of districts, so dividing that by 5. And it's that number we use to determine, as we were discussing earlier, there can be no greater than a 10% deviation. That's how we determine what your specific deviation is, and it's 2.77%. So the current districts are within the boundaries of under that 10% threshold. And as you can see here, we have the demographic breakdowns as well for both the citizen voting age population and total population. And in the upcoming slides, I'll show you that graphically by census block on the maps. Here's an important component here. So right now, as we discussed, the current districts are population balanced using the 2020 census data. So meaning you're in that 10% threshold. We are currently reviewing, and we'll have this review complete in between now and December 7th, which is the next hearing here. We're reviewing the districts to see if they are in compliance with the applicable federal and state voting laws, so particularly the Federal Voting Rights Act, as well as AB 849 compliance. If West Covina determines that there are no issues with the federal and state voting laws, then the council at that point can make a decision. Would you like to continue the redistricting process to consider changes to neighborhoods and communities of interest, if any, and refine the current district lines, or would you like to keep the current districts as is? Okay? I want to stress that that is if there are no issues in compliance with federal and state voting laws. And regardless of that decision, West Covina must still hold the 4 required hearings and pass an ordinance to adopt the district boundaries, either current or changed, by April 17th. So regardless of whether they make the decision, if there's no issues, to keep districts as is or do the redistricting process, still need to go through the 4 public hearings. As I mentioned, the Census Bureau gives us data for citizen voting age population and a variety of statistics by census block. So you'll see each one of these next maps shows a particular demographic by census block, and you'll see the different geography for each one of those. That's the Census Bureau defines those. And we overlay that with the demographic data. For each one of these maps, you'll see the coloring scheme for the percentages is the exact same. So the purple and blue colors denote a lower percentage for a particular demographic, and the orange and reddish colors denote a higher percentage. So here we're showing the Latino citizen voting age population, and you can see particularly in the center and the northern parts of the city, there are some pretty significant concentrations of Latino citizen voting age population. And actually, if you go back here, you can see that currently, in terms of citizen voting age population, districts 1, 2, and 3 have majority Latino districts in terms of citizen voting age population. Here is the Asian American citizen voting age population. And again, the southern and eastern portions of the cities have some concentrations of Asian American citizen voting age population. Here is the African American citizen voting age population. And then the other thing that we get from the Census Bureau is what's called the American Communities Survey. So each household gets a Census Bureau form, but I believe it's 1 in 15 or 1 in 17 households get a further in-depth survey. Maybe, I don't know if anyone got that. And it asks more in-depth questions related to, do you rent your house or do you own your house? What language is spoken at home? What's your income level? And so if you get one of those deeper surveys, that gets information into what's called the American Community Survey, and that's where we get this data from. And I gave you by way of an example here. This is percentage renters within the city. And we get, like I said, multiple different sets. We get languages spoken at home from here, income statistics, which is right here. Then they denote, again, income of $75,000 or more. And there's multiple different data sets here that we can show you and put graphically if there's interest. Now we'd like to talk a little bit about the specific AB 849 definitions when we're talking about neighborhoods and communities of interest. Because, again, if that's something that we're going to move forward on the redistricting process, we need to consider whether there are particular areas that you, as the general public, would like to define as either a neighborhood or a community of interest. So neighborhoods are exactly what you would think they are. The geographic boundary, they could have natural dividing lines, mountains, rivers, streams. It could have unnatural dividing lines like roads, highways, those types of things. Or it could be a particular landmark, so an area around a park or a school, or other neighborhood landmarks. When we talk about communities of interest, it takes that idea of a geographic area and adds a shared issue or characteristic on top of it. So it could be a shared social or economic interest. It could be an area impacted by city or county policies that have similar. And what we're asking for you to do is to tell us your community's story. And the question specifically that we're asking for, and you'll see in quotes there, this is taken directly from AB 849 as to how they define a community of interest. Would this community benefit from being included within a single district for its purposes of its effective and fair representation? Or would it benefit more from having multiple representatives? And that's a policy choice for both you and the council to make and to give us feedback on. One important thing to remember is that definitions of communities of interest may not include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. Just wanted to give you some potential ideas for neighborhoods and communities. And just before I get into that, I just want to say this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just something to kind of begin the discussion. And you can add to this, you can take away from this. Please give us your feedback on this. So potentially the freeway corridor in some of the commercial areas, the Azusa Avenue corridor within the city. Are there particular homeowners associations or neighborhoods that might make sense to define as a community of interest? And remember that these are specific areas that, if they make sense, would be an area that you want to keep together for its purposes of effective and fair representation. So tonight's discussion, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have about the process here. And we'd also be looking for feedback on, are there areas that you'd like to define that meet the AB 849 definition for neighborhoods and communities of interest that you would like to flag and state that would make sense to keep together in one district? One final slide here, and we'll open up for questions. I want to talk about the timeline here. So our first public workshop is tonight. And it counts as a hearing for the requirements. There needs to be at least 4 public hearings, as I mentioned. The second public hearing will be on December 7th, and then we're still determining in 2022 when the final 2 hearings will be. We'll be sure to post those once we have that. But again, the most important thing is that the 4 hearings have to be completed, and a map and an election sequence has to be determined by no later than April 17th of 2022 to be able to submit on time to the Los Angeles County Registrar of Voters. And this map and election sequence that is determined will be used in the November 2022 elections and beyond. So with that, I'm going to stop here and would be happy to answer any questions or get feedback from you regarding communities that you would like to define. So thank you for your consideration.
Good evening. JD, would you like to come to the mic, or would you like me to bring you a mic? Want me to come? I'll come to you.
Oops.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I know. She's so darn pretty. She's so darn pretty.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Jeff.
Jeff! Good name. Jeff, I have 2 questions. My first question has to do with the possibility, due to change in the boundaries, what happens if that change takes place and the council currently sitting on there that is scheduled to run for election 2024 is now under the 2022 boundary guidelines? What would happen then? So that hopefully you can understand my question. Those that will be running for office in 2022 are okay. But if the boundaries change, those that are scheduled to run in 2024, I believe is what you said, what if all of a sudden their district, they're out of the district, or they're in a district now that calls for the election in 2022?
Yes, so they would be able to serve out their term,
Okay.
but it's a council decision in term, and it's obviously with feedback from the public as to what that election sequence would be. So there's discretion in terms of being able to say yes, which districts again you want to put into 2022 and put into 2024.
Okay. My second question is in regards to community of interest. What happens if the change in or the consideration of community interests such as economics or social, maybe ethnicity, I'm not sure what other factor may play a role in that, makes the boundary line no longer contiguous, is the word I believe you used?
That's a good question. So, an important one, because I want to remember, I specifically use the term when we're talking about undivided neighborhoods and communities of interest, when practicable. So, and remember that when we're talking about the California criteria for cities, and specifically the ones in the light blue box there, those are rank ordered. So geographic contiguity is a higher rank than communities of interest are. So there could be a reason, and let me give you an example. Let's say you define a community of interest, but it's larger than, for example, in terms of population, than what would be in the allowable deviation. Okay, so you could define that community, but because of that, you're having more than a 10% deviation. In that instance, the Federal Voting Rights Act takes precedent over keeping that community of interest together, and that could be an example as a reason why you might split that up. So it's something that when we identify communities of interest, it's something that we try to shoot for. But if there are reasons and items that have a higher priority in terms of ranking, whether that be a Federal Voting Rights Act or geographic contiguity, that would be a reason to split that up.
I think Angie had a question.
Question: for those that are interested in submitting a potential plan, saying that, pretending that we are actually going to look at plans submitted by the public, will there be information, for example, north of the freeway, what that population exists horizontally from west to east? Will the numbers be provided so that someone could estimate based on the number dividing equally? Could numbers be provided for north of the freeway from west to east to the residents so they can make a calculation for their submitted plan?
Yeah, that's numbers that we can run, and yeah, we can look into that.
Actually, my question is similar to Ms. Gillingham's. When we did this the last time, the citizens submitted, I believe it was 20 different plans of how to draw the boundaries, and the council selected one of those 20. And the city provided software to the citizens through the internet so that each census tract population was detailed so that the citizens could draw the boundaries and do the math directly in the software. And I don't see any mention of a citizen participation in this process the way you've described it. And I would be looking for that in the process. There would be one new element that would have to be introduced this time. If a citizen is proposing a change from the existing boundary, I think they would have to state the reasons why they would like the change based on the rules and goals that you've outlined there. To justify the fact that they want the boundaries different, they'd have to be, I think, consistent with some of those rules and goals that have been outlined. But other than that, the mechanical part of it should be the same, that citizens should be able to submit recommended boundaries for the districts. And I'm disturbed that there's no allusion to that in the process the way you've outlined it.
Yeah, so I don't believe the city has made a determination yet whether that process is going to take place, but that's something that we can certainly bring up with staff.
Okay, I'm just saying the purpose of this meeting today, at least according to the agenda, was to talk about the process. And that's why I'm saying what I'm saying. This is germane to the process that's going to be undergone. The way it was described was we could talk about vague things like what we think is a community of interest, but that isn't what the actual real process is about. The real process is about drawing lines on a map.
Understood, but there's very specific regulations associated, as I mentioned here. The two initial meetings have to be prior. You have to have at least two hearings prior to being able to draw maps. So this is one of them, and so we're not. Can't specifically talk about
I realize that the maps aren't going to be drawn right now. My point was that the process has to have room for that. That's what I'm trying to say.
Understood.
That's it.
Remind me, I thought you also said there was going to be a selected committee that was going to be developed. Is that? Could you clarify that, or did I misunderstand?
I didn't make mention of a committee. No.
So, sorry, I'll go real quick. She's got a mic here for you. I think the concern that Jim was trying to convey is probably my concern as well, and maybe even Angie's. And if I'm wrong, I apologize. I think the concern is I think we understand that there's two meetings that have to happen before any type of map drafting process. I think we get that. I think the concern is this seems like a meeting to say, here's the process, but the process we're talking about isn't even in the list of things to do or in that list. At least I didn't see it. And so I think there's a concern that it's going to be glossed over. And so that's one of the biggest concerns. And I remember from the last districting process, which was the first time we did this, the draft process, the map drafting, which I'm assuming may or may not happen here, took the longest. I mean, it went for weeks and meetings and all of that kind of stuff. They gave tons and tons and tons of time. It just seems like this is, two quick meetings right away. I understand, get those off the thing, we can move to the next step, but it just seems to me, like what Jim was saying, and I think Angie, that it just doesn't look like there was even a plan in there to say this is when we hope to do maps if the council moves forward. Because I take it as there's 4 meetings that have to be responded to or done, but the council could choose just to not take any maps. That's the way I'm understanding. Is that correct? They could choose just to keep it the same way?
It's as long as, again, there are no concerns related to either the federal or California voting laws, then yes, that is a decision that they could make. Again, we will circle back with staff regarding the process here. Okay, so based on your company's expertise, and this is what you guys do for a living, when you look at the 2.7% variation, that falls within that 10% variation. So the reality, unless you find something in this other report that you're looking up, then you'll have by December 7th. Right now, it doesn't appear that there is a reason for them to even consider a new boundary. Would that be an assumption that I'm reading right? No, we're reviewing that.
Okay.
Yes, but again, that's not the only thing that we're looking at. That's
So if we go back to the percentages thing real quick, if you could, I forget the slide number. Yeah, 7. There we go. So on here, you're showing 2.77% deviation, and each district is give or take 0.5%. One of them's even at 0.5 or 0.05. But you're only looking at a couple percentage points at most for each one. 2.7 for the whole city. Barring another report that you're trying to get for December 7th, based on just what we're seeing as residents, this report does not look like that it warrants a change. And I understand you're looking for more data. I get that. But I'm taking this at face value just like you're showing it at face value. It doesn't look like there's even a need to consider changing lines. And so I guess what I'm trying to understand is if the council decides not to change lines, what is that process? What's the differences between we're going to put it out for draft maps like Angie asked, what are the numbers? How do we draw maps like we did last time? Because there was all that data, like Jim mentioned online, all this stuff. Or are we, I'm going to speak for myself. I don't think this council listens much to this community anyways. So my belief is they're going to just rubber stamp this through after 4 things and keep it the same way and not make a change. Again, that's my opinion. I'm not putting words in your mouth. But it's one of those things where based on this, it looks like they could do that. So I kind of want to know the differences that they have to work their way through, whether they decide to keep a map, keep the current list, or keep the stripes, the lines, or if they do decide to go with a map process. Those are 2 completely different roads, and I want to understand that, if I could, please.
Sure. It's not necessarily 2 completely different roads, as I mentioned here. So, regardless, and I want to be very, very clear. We have not completed our determination yet. So we are not saying either way you can keep your districts or you can't. Okay? So that has not been completed yet. Regardless of the outcome of that analysis, the city council still has to hold 4 public hearings on a map. And if, for example, they say we want to move forward on the process and doing the redistricting, we will again circle back with staff, and we can have a discussion related to will there be an online mapping tool offered or those type of things. That just hasn't been determined yet. We can, yeah, I can, first of all, we probably put this presentation online.
It is online.
And then I can.
So under the city clerk's department, there's a tab that says 2021 redistricting. And there it shows the tentative schedule. It has today's town hall meeting, and it has a tab that says documents. And so if you click on that, you get this PowerPoint presentation. You're welcome. And that website will be updated as we get information, as we establish meeting dates. That website will be updated. You're welcome.
So in the 2016 timeframe, when this first was done, I think it was 2016, sounds about right. Like Jim said, there was 20 plus maps submitted. Are those maps still on file here at the city, the ones that were originally submitted back in 2016? Do we have those on file here? Or at least the data for each one?
I can get back to you on that.
Okay. So my reason why I'm asking, and you probably have to get back to me on this one too, so I'll just kind of throw it out there. I would love to know if they go down and we get into the drafting of maps, I would like to regurgitate those maps and see if they meet requirements. Because if they come back and say these current districts don't, rather than recreating the wheel on some of those maps, I'd like to regurgitate some of them and get the data and see if it's what's current based on those lines, and hopefully save the public some time in drafting some maps. I'm sure a lot of people, if it gets to that point, would want to re-enter some things. And so I think those maps would be good historical data, as well as possibly something that if the council moves forward with maps, we could start there, if you kind of follow me.
I understand you.
If we go down the road of generating maps, since the population has increased, ethnicity's changed, community of interest has come and gone. Does the city currently have a breakout of all those changes, or will that be part of that process? My second question is,
Sorry, just not to interrupt, but when you say the breakdown of all of those changes,
breakout
are
by precincts or by districts, current districts.
so you want to see, so this what we presented tonight was the 2020 data. Did you want to see what the 2010 data is with the current district? I just want to clarify what you're asking for.
Maybe you've already shown it, and I'm just so blind I can't see it, and I wasn't paying close attention, obviously. But I was hoping that at some point the city would show a breakout of the current data of the changes in ethnicity, population, the factors that were relevant during the first process in creation of districts. Did you have a slide on that tonight? I may have missed it.
No, I just showed the 2020 demographics, but you're saying, would you like to see a slide that's like this, but also with the 2010 demographics to see what's changed?
The comparison would be good.
Okay.
But I also would like it to be West Covina specific, of course, right? Not a consensus, not the data from the consensus, because that's far greater. It has to be specific to West Covina, and that's what I wasn't sure if you had shown tonight or not. It is.
It is, yes.
That is the existing districts as drawn with the new 2020 data.
Okay, and I know I had, okay, my second question, which is a real easy one, is this one of the 4 hearings for the map process that you just responded?
So there's four total hearings, 2 that are prior to the draft maps, and then 2 what we call post-map hearings. So this counts for one of the 2 pre-map hearings.
This is absent map consideration. This is more just a general overview of the process.
Yes, and you have to have 2 of those prior to even considering maps. Required.
There was a lot of work put into the maps that we have now by a lot of people. There was enormous participation. In fact, I don't think the city has had any other activity at all that had this much participation as that map drawing.
Yeah, I think what Jim just said is right. There was an immense amount of work, and I know it was the first time we ever did districts, and there's still animosity of whether we should or shouldn't have districts. In fact, there's only one person on this council who was on the council when the last districts were done, and he openly wanted against districts. Now, I don't know what he wants to do now. He's changed his mind on everything. But I mean, it's one of those things where, we've got 4 people up there who don't have a clue as to how the fight went before, unless they were paying attention as a resident. And I don't know if they did or not. I know one of them's husband was animate against districts, but again, that's goes back and forth too with the wind. So yeah, I think the big question for me is, I know we've got to do one more meeting, which sounds like that meeting is more dog and pony of numbers than it is really anything substantial for us. So I guess get that out of the way so we can determine if we're getting to maps, because if we're redrawing maps, we need time, and I don't think this council is going to give us that time, but that's my opinion. And so then at that point, it's just a matter of seeing where we go, which is kind of why I want to regurgitate the old maps and see how they fit into this new census numbers, to see if it's taking, like Jim said, all of that time that we put in 5 years ago and being able to use it, because we got to live with whatever we do for 10 more years, or we got to live with whatever they do for 10 more years. That's kind of my thoughts on it. But yeah, that's where I stand. Is I think we need to, this meeting is pretty much a dog and pony show at this point.
Do we have any other questions?
Well,
hold on for the mic so we can hear you.
Shut such a loud. And this is just for educational reasons, for just to know what the heck is going on here. Barring the idea of a legal challenge in either way, would this be the time where the city can elect to either go back to a charter city or continue as districts, or is that a possibility?
I don't believe we were ever a charter city.
Okay, or the way we once were.
With, at large.
At large, thank you.
Okay.
That's the word I was looking for. Yes, you're right.
And so the answer to that question is that there's really no, and I don't want to overstep my bounds here, but you've probably heard about, for example, the Santa Monica case that is arguing right now. It's gone through the state Supreme Court about whether should go to districts or not. That city has spent $7 million on legal fees, and the plaintiffs in that case have asked for $22 million. And there have been significant settlements across this state related to forcing cities into districts. So there's in our opinion, very little to no room to go back to an at-large district, and quite frankly would probably lead to a legal challenge associated with that.
Okay, so I understand the challenge, and I understand that the cost is the recovery fees from the attorneys would probably bankrupt the city. That was probably the reason why we went districts and didn't present a challenge. But my question is this, because when we went through the process the first time, Mrs. Barlow, then city attorney, said that when a certain point in time would come where the city can actually opt to going back to at large, is this that point in time?
I can't speak to. I don't know what I can't opine on the city attorney's position. But
that's fine.
From our understanding, you've seen the cases.
Yeah, and to answer your question a little bit there, JD, because I kind of followed it, is in 2016, the way that the settlement was explained at a city council meeting was that we had to hold two elections, 2018, 2020, by then city attorney, I believe was who said it, or the council or staff report or whatever. And then at that point, the city had the option, if they wanted to go back to an at-large city. We were only, the way it was explained was to be required to do two in the settlement. That's how that was explained to the public at those meetings. His answer is basically, if we go back, we could open ourselves up to another lawsuit. I believe we could have won that lawsuit. I know he says there's millions of dollars spent, and he's right. And I love the fact that Santa Monica is currently fighting this, and I hope that they win. I think they have a chance. But the reality is that is going to have to go probably through the complete process. Palmdale settled and filed basically a settlement, and they paid a lot of money out. And there's a couple of others, like he's saying, with big settlements. But the reality is no actual city has went through and solved or completed a case to the very end of this. And if it does go through, as he said, through the Supreme Court in California, we'll see where that goes. But that's basically the gist that we were given back in 2016, I think it was, that all of that was given when they first signed it. And that was when Lloyd Johnson, Mike Spence, Corey Warshaw, James Toma, and Tony Wu, I believe, was on the council, if I remember correctly. Those were the five that were on there that voted. And I believe Tony Wu voted against and Mike Spence voted against going to districts. The other three voted for it.
I think you're absolutely right. Thank you. And that does answer my question. So that is an option, an alternative to mapping, changing the map, or going back through the map process that we did originally. The city does have the option of...
You saying going back to at-large is an
right, and taking on the legal challenge. Obviously, it may not be feasible for the city to do, but not be wise. Nevertheless, it is an option, and this is the time for that decision. That's what I really want to know.
I wouldn't call it an option, but that's something, again, to ask the city or ask the city attorney their opinion on.
This council is known to take bad decisions as options, so I would still call it an option.
have any further questions? No? Okay. I'd like to, Jeff, do you have any closing?
No, again, we're continuing the review. We'll be wrapping that up before the December 7th hearing, and again, December 7th will be the next public hearing associated with this. And thank you for your feedback this evening.
Thank you all for your time and have a good night.